Okay, let's do this thing. Are you guys ready? All right. So, hello and welcome. Welcome to this podcast on visual literacy. I'm Kay Sullivan, and together today we are going to explore how ideas are conveyed through images. Now, technology is fundamentally changing our dominant forms of communication. More information now can be transmitted through visual imagery because of this technology. So I've read recently that the average person is exposed to between 250 and 3,000 images a day, between half and two-thirds of them through television and the computer. So without visual literacy, visual cues can be associated with ideas through a conditioned response. And these are artificially manufactured ideas, artificially manufactured knowledge and judgment, and that feels completely like it's being derived internally, but it is not. It is a conditioned response. So visual literacy is crucially important as technology is changing how communication is being produced and delivered and received. Visual literacy is fundamental to this process. In fact, it's at the heart of media literacy and digital literacy and information literacy, I believe, and many other new literacies that are emerging now that are collectively being called the 21st century literacies. But this new knowledge that now needs to be taught and mastered is not based on accumulation of facts or content like it used to be. It is now based upon the acquisition of skills to manage dynamic information. We're getting buried in information, and so the new literacy skills teach us how to traverse that information and interpret it correctly. So teachers, librarians, educators also need to upgrade their literacy skills so that they stay professionally relevant in these changing times. So let's talk for a second about visual literacy and what it is. So literacy, just in general, refers to the ability to use critical thinking skills to read for knowledge and to write coherently. So if we were to apply that to visual literacy, it's the same principle: read and write, decode and encode, but it would be slanted toward visual text. So the ability, it would basically mean the ability to think critically about visual imagery with knowledge of visual language, which we will be learning today, to create coherent ideas with visual text. Okay, and visual text is just basically imagery that contains information. And not all imagery contains information, but we will look at that. So let's take a step back for a second. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I'm, again, Kay Sullivan. I am working on I'm nearly done with another master's, this one in education. This one is in learning technology and instructional design. I've been in media arts for 20 years, and so I am looking to bring together my professional experience with in a learning environment. This is my attempt to put a instructional design upon some of the things that I know so that I can contribute to a knowledge community on this. I think visual literacy is important and foundational to a lot of the new literacies. So now let's talk a little bit about you. What are you going to be doing and learning over the next hour? So We already talked about me. What I've done is broken this down into 3 sections, and this is based on a classical education, also known as the trivium. If you don't know that word, you might want to Google that. It's really interesting, and it teaches how it teaches critical thinking skills. So I just applied that to this project. So we start out with our grammar, our visual grammar, and we will learn all those terms that are listed there. We then go on to logic, or to, in this case, storytelling, and what the framework is around the concepts that's embedded in there. And third, discerning the visual message. What is the intended message of the visual presentation or the imagery? And sometimes that's different than what they intend and what actually comes out. So at the end of this hour, you will obtain first, in the first section, a basic visual grammar so that you can talk about, so you can translate visual imagery into language and communicate that to others. In the second portion, we will decode the elements of visual text, which includes metaphor and narrative and archetype, stereotype, these larger frameworks that help us interpret ideas. And in the third, we will apply a classical rhetoric technique to infer visual messages. So we will be able to nail down the intended message by the sender. You know, who is the source, and what is the appeal to logic, what is the appeal to emotion, and classic rhetoric techniques. So let's start with section 1. Visual grammar. Visual grammar is necessary to build your visual language so that you can communicate in a visual realm. So acquiring knowledge of your visual grammar is not only fundamental to your practice of visual communication, but it builds, again, your visual language to articulate the concepts behind your ideas. Now, there's going to be a lot of terms that we are going to go over today. I would recommend that you either download the worksheet if it is available, or grab a pen to write down some of the terms and vocabulary, because there's a ton of vocabulary, but it's really going to be helpful as the discussion goes forward, so we can talk the same language. So let's talk about visual grammar and the basic vocabulary we are going to be talking about in section 1. So the first is elements. These are visual elements that can be discerned with the eye, such as shape and lines and patterns, as well as arrangement in terms of balance and contrast. These are things that you can visually recognize. There's not a lot of interpretation that's necessarily needed for larger, context. We're going to talk about the subject of the photo and the context as well. Historical context, cultural context, these things. We're going to talk about the angle. Who are you in this photo? And how does that affect the story? And finally, the purpose. So we are going to be working from these 4 images again and again and again. I could have come up with like 1,000 trillion images, but I really wanted to take very specific images through the entire process so that we can start by discerning lines and shapes and colors and patterns, and then put them into a context. The 3 on the bottom are the ones that are the activities for you. The one at the top is the one that we're going to keep coming back to, kind of as our master image, so that we just keep breaking it down over the next hour. And so it'll be pretty fascinating how it all lays out. So again, grab a pen, grab your paper or your worksheet if you can download that, and so that you can write down some definitions, because we're going to blaze through this in a seriously fast way. So, first off, the elements. Elements are things like shape, line, scale, pattern, texture, light. I want to talk to you a little bit about shape. Shape is fascinating. So if you see here in this photo, the dominant shapes are squares. And this is my opinion. And squares psychologically represent stability and dependability and structure and legacy, and it's a very male shape. And you can see that on either side of him, structuring him in there, and his foundation is also square. Now you see behind him, though, there's a circle there. And circles tend to represent life force and fluidity and the female principle and creation. So it's interesting that he has this circle behind him and a circle above his head, a strange half circle that makes some weird lines over his head there. So anyway, so we've got the shapes and the lines and the balance and the contrast. You can see that in terms of balance, this is almost like a palindrome image. It is the same on the right as on the left, which that uber balance right there really says a lot about what it is trying to convey. It has a lot of repetition. In terms of the contrast, there's not a lot of contrast between the front and the back. You can tell there's a background, but there's not a lot of depth in this photo. And so it looks almost a little bit confrontational because of that, conceivably. So now let's take elements and arrangement, and it's your turn now to break down the elements and arrangement of this photo. Again, I want you to look for shape. If you notice, she's making a circle with her body. She's also separated by a line from a wall of people behind. She's noticed the color that she's wearing, red, which is the color of life. It's a life force color. So take a moment, jot down some thoughts. I have the list there underneath the photo. This is your reflection time. Okay, time's up. Well, I told you we're going to be blazing through this. Okay, subject. Let's talk about that for a second. So there's a main subject and a supporting subject. So what we're looking for is dominance and subordination. Obviously, the dominant subject in this is the individual in the middle. And what's interesting about it is that he's also a blend of the two things on the side, the red and the blue. So he brings the two sides into balance. And so that's interesting. Supporting subject, you know, that's, I don't know, it could be the flags, you know, patriotism. The supporting subject could also be the fact that there is only one mic there, microphone, so that shows a control of message. You know, just some ideas of subject and supporting subject. Context. Now, this photo is steeped in symbolic context and cultural context and historical context. Some of the symbolism that's in here you wouldn't necessarily know if you weren't enculturated with it. A lot of context comes from culture and perspective. There are certain images that that have been presented to us since a very early age to represent country, to represent history. And in terms of the location, we can't really confirm what the location is, but according to this photo, the location would be someplace official, safe, like a bunker. It looks very secure. So let's take subject and context and look at this one, which is interesting. The main subject is it a person? Is the main subject a person? Or is the main subject the person in the mask? The contrast between the male mask and the obvious female figure that's wearing it is also an interesting juxtaposition to show that this person is possibly putting on a false front, or you'd have to know something about the Guy Fawkes stuff, which is part of the context, as well as the Google glasses. That's part of the context. And it will mean different things to different people. So I'm going to be silent for a moment and let you reflect on this. There is the list of the different things you're looking for. Okay. So I hope that was interesting. What you were able to discern, even just in 1 minute, armed with a little bit of information. So let's now talk about the angle and who are you in this story? Who are we in this story? From this image, I would say that we are an audience. This is definitely not a personal discussion. We are situated lower than him. He is situated up high. He's also looking above our heads. He's also looking to the right, which is interesting because visually there's the right path, the right-hand path and the left-hand path, the path of peace and the path of war. So you can also see which direction he's looking, because that is a cue of what is being said. So we have our angle, the purpose. What is the purpose of this communication? Is it to persuade us of his authority, of his assuredness? Is it just simply to document an event, a press conference of some kind, or an address to the nation? Is it to express something, an intention of some kind? And the last thing you can ask when you're looking for the purpose of it is, who is the intended audience of this? I would say likely people who consume news. Would it be world leaders? Would it be the population that he governs? This would change it. So let's look at angle and purpose. This is one of my... This picture is hilarious. I don't know why it's hilarious. It probably is not hilarious at all, actually. But there's a lot of peculiarities in this photo. Let's just say that. So let's take a look at the angle and the purpose of this shot. I'm going to try not to commentate over the top of this. I'm going to let you come up with your own interpretation. But who are you in this photo? And what is the purpose of it? Jot some ideas down. I'll be quiet. All right. So we have now completed section 1. Great job. So we have covered 6 important vocabulary words. Elements being lines, shapes, patterns. Arrangement being repetition, balance, contrast. We've talked about what the subject is. And what the supporting subject is. And it's the subject and the supporting subject are not necessarily even the people in the photo. It could be an idea. Context. We can now place certain context within it. The historical context, the cultural context. And these are very personal, the context. It's how we each interpret. We took a look at the angle and the purpose. So we're moving on now to the next section. I hope you grasped all of those. In this section, we're going to be talking about visual text. And this is cool because this is where we can start talking about storytelling through visuals and the narrative. So what we're going to cover are these 6 areas. We're going to distinguish between symbols and icons, and we're going to talk about stereotypes and archetypes, and what is a trope. How do we use metaphors, and what is that exactly, and how do we place a narrative? So decoding visual text is fundamental to infer meaning using the visual grammar we just learned and are learning here, and because it helps us extract embedded information for a deeper insight into visual messaging. So it's one thing to be able to break it down by lines and shapes and colors and contrasts, and it's another thing to put some deeper meaning around it. So let's talk about the difference between an icon and a symbol. An icon represents what it actually stands for because it's a real object, whereas a symbol doesn't represent what it stands for at all, and the meaning has to be learned. So this photo is an iconic photo, meaning it resembles what it stands for. The object is real. The commander-in-chief of the United States is a real person, but you could put literally anybody in that space and it would still represent the same thing. That's why it's iconic, because the character can be switched in and out and it will still kind of mean the same thing. Now a symbol doesn't resemble what it stands for at all. So like that eagle that's on the flag there, unless you learn what that is, you can't deduce it just by looking at it. So let's take a moment, and now this one's a little bit tough, the symbols and the icons. You know, the symbols don't represent what they mean at all, and the icon represents something real. So what in this photo is iconic? Can you deduce just by looking at it because it represents it? And what is a symbol that you would not know unless someone told you what it meant? Go ahead and jot that down. Okay, moving on. Archetypes and stereotypes. The archetype basically gives motion and movement to the narrative, whereas the stereotype is a one-dimensional representation of the character, and it's easy to identify. The stereotype here is politician, powerful politician. Um, it's just a one-dimensional thing. It kind of doesn't matter who it is because it's a stereotype. The archetype gives motion and movement to the narrative. Now, archetypes are interesting in this context because we could interpret it as, for example, the hero archetype, which their main desire is to prove their worth through heroic deeds, or where there's a will, there's a way. Or conceivably, it could be a ruler who's, oh, my writing here. Their objective is control, and in order to create a prosperous family or community. That's the ruler. So there's actually 12 basic archetypes: the innocent, the commoner, the hero, the explorer, the rebel, the lover, the creator, the sage, the ruler. And these are what gives motivation to the person or the situation in the photo or in the image. So it's good to know a bunch of these off the top of your head so that you can identify them. Okay, tropes. Tropes are commonly recurring themes or plot devices. It's something that is easily categorized by the audience, a lot like a stereotype, except the trope is just the motif. It's like a stereotypical environment, you know. So when we look at this photo here, the trope, the motif, the theme is powerful politician addressing a crowd. Not a lot of thought has to go into that one. I mean, it's pretty obvious what the trope is here. It's easily identified is the main thing. So, I still feel like I have to fill up every single second with the sound of my voice. I will get over this. All right, so now it's your turn. The stereotype. That's fairly easy. The archetype. What's motivating this person? Is she an innocent with a desire to get to paradise with the goal of being happy? Is she a lover with a desire for intimacy and experience with the goal of relating to others and being surrounded by beauty? And or is she a jester? And what's the trope? The trope should be very easy to identify. It's the red carpet. So it's got a very identifiable trope, a very identifiable stereotype, and then whatever archetype you assign to it gives it meaning. Okay, moving on. The narrative. The narrative describes the events and connects them in a story-like way. So while the archetype gives motivation to the movement of the story, the narrative actually connects the events that archetype is on. And narratives use devices such as character, context, the story arc, or the events, and the meaning, or the plot. Now, I think that we've probably gotten far enough in our discussion here that you could probably easily break down character, context, and possibly even story arc based upon archetypes and tropes. And the meaning, that's more of a personal thing. Metaphor. Metaphors are tricky. They are a representation of something or an idea. It's a representation of two things to suggest an association. Okay. And usually it takes a little bit of effort to draw out the lesson. Metaphors are not easy to find. In this particular one, the metaphor could be conceivably to connect the the role of the President of the United States with power or with authority or with patriotism. There's a lot of things that we could put in there. Metaphors are tricky, and I'm still learning also how to distinguish metaphors because they're tough. So now it's your turn. This is, again, coming back to one of my favorite little pictures here. I want you to construct a narrative for this. Using character and plot, context. What's the metaphor? What is the image trying to connect? What is the idea the image is trying to connect with? It's interesting in all of these, the visual text, the storytelling, the symbols and the icons. The stereotypes are easy to identify. In the lower group photo, the stereotypes are usually culturally bound. The stereotype would be very different in the culture in the West than it would be in other places. As well as the archetype, the motivation assigned to that particular photo could be vastly different depending on who is looking at it. The tropes are easily identified environments in which to place the character. And the narrative, what's the story? And the metaphor, what's the idea it's associating with? So, boom, not included in the outline. I've also added a portion here on reading people, because that's an important skill to have if you're going to be visually literate. So we're going to look at things like gestures. Where are their hands? Are they out in front? Are they behind their backs? We're going to be looking at where are their arms? Are they tucked into their chest? Are they crossing over their chest? We're going to look at facial expression. And what does that mean? We'll take a look at the body language, meaning distances and code matching, as well as identity, age, gender, ethnicity. All of these elements are used subconsciously as we look at these things, and we're just going to bring these into the conscious forefront so that we can analyze them. So let's take a look at this one. Gestures. Let's take a look at his arms. They're close to his body, rigid. He has his hands out in front, pointing forward, pointing toward the viewer. He has his thumbs up to draw the eye upward as well. His fingers are close together, showing a sturdiness there. His facial expression. He doesn't have much of a facial expression here, and in fact, he's not actually looking at the viewer. His eyes are up above the viewer's head, looking off to the right. His mouth is open as if he is imparting knowledge or imparting information. His body language. Well, this one's good for body language here. This is the distance between the subject, the main subject, and the supporting subject. They're very close together. The code matching of all of the people behind him, saying, we have a united front. He's the only one who's showing his face, the main guy. So he is unafraid. He's also the only one looks like he's not armed, which means he's protected. The age, gender, ethnicity. The ethnicity cannot be completely determined from this photo. A general area of the world could probably be pointed toward, but we don't exactly really know just from this photo who these people are or what they want, aside from what we can get from the visual cues. So that wraps section 2. I told you we were going to be blazing through this. Hopefully this is going as fast for you as it is for me, because I would hate this is dragging for you. But anyway, we are now at section 3. Using rhetoric to determine the visual message. Now, using the methods of classical rhetoric is helpful to infer meaning from the visual text that we just talked about in the last section, to discern the intended and unintended visual message. Now, rhetoric is the use of ethos, logos, and pathos. Ethos being a examination of the source, the logos being an examination of the logical appeal that is being intentionally used, and the pathos is the emotional appeal that's being used. So let's take a look at the ethos first. The ethos is the source, and we have a slide coming up here in a little while that is fascinating, that will completely illustrate this point. But the point being that the perceived credibility of the creator of the visual image and even the messenger of the visual image, where did you get the image from? Did you get it off of a news site, or did you get it off of Funny or Die, because our perception of the source affects the perception of the image. If we believe that it comes from a news source, we will tend to put less scrutiny on it. We will just take it for reality, mostly. The logos is what is the logical appeal designed into the image to influence the audience. Now, this can usually be found in the concrete details, the logical appeal. So if you think back to that group photo, the dudes with the guns, the logical appeal there is the things that we can find in the concrete details. These dudes have their faces covered, they're holding guns, they're all dressed in paramilitary. These types of concrete details formulate a logical structure around how we interpret it. And so you can find the logical appeal most often in the concrete details. Now, the pathos is the emotional appeal that is designed into the image to influence the audience, and these are usually found in the symbolic details. And again, symbolism is learned. It is learned through culture, it is learned through family, it is learned through one's own studies. But, and also, symbolism appeals to the subconscious. So whether or not you understand the symbolism doesn't mean it's not actually affecting you. So that's why it's important to learn this unspoken language of visual text and visual language, um, because it's still affecting you. The subconscious effects of, say, the circle and the square, it has an emotional, psychological effect on you, whether or not you're conscious of it. So when we look at these four images, the ethos being the source, if these came from a news outlet, would you look at it differently than if it was a promotional material? The logos, what is the logical appeal? What are the concrete facts you can gather from the photo? You know, the one with the mask and the Google glasses. The logical appeal. There's a person wearing a mask. Um, you know, it helps to know this, the symbology, the symbolism of the mask and of the glasses, but you don't necessarily need to know that in order to formulate an opinion based on the concrete facts or on the concrete images. And the pathos, the emotional appeal. Now, ethos, this is the one that I told you that is an excellent um, example of how the source affects how we view the image. Now, these two photos are the same in their iconography. They have a very similar looking person, but the lower one is actually a celebrity impersonator. So just knowing that this is a promotional photo versus something that was pulled from, I think, ABC News, changes the meaning of the picture completely, even though it uses all the same symbolism. So I thought this was an interesting one to really show how the source can discredit the image or give it more credibility. The logos, again, the logical appeal. Oh, here it comes. This is such a difficult image, because there's a lot of juxtapositions in this. And so what is the concrete details that we can pull out of this? You know, the person wearing the mask is fairly defenseless. They're wearing a little tank top, it looks like. It's also a female wearing a male mask. So they are disguising their identity, perhaps. The Google glasses on a Guy Fawkes mask is, it takes a lot of processing to come up with how is that appealing to your logic and reasoning. Now, the pathos, the emotional appeal, is usually a little bit easier because we can just go on, oh, this is kind of how it makes me feel. But, and it's also very personal. The emotional appeal has a lot to do with the cultural context. That group photo is going to be interpreted much differently by different people. And same with the red carpet. Some people would see that like dream come true, and other people would be like, oh, she's, you know, entering the pits of hell, about to sell her soul. Whatever, I don't know. And of course, the president there, the emotional appeal toward authority. So, we have wrapped out our three categories, our three subjects here. I hope you have seen through this how mastering visual literacy is essential to communicating in our contemporary world. notes here. Where are they? Here they are. Um, and when we are visually literate, we can absorb more information, and it turbocharges the information processing because we don't need to read things. We can scan it visually, we can put a visual language around it and get a deeper meaning from it. So the question is, if this stuff is new to you or it doesn't really come naturally, how do you develop strong visual literacy within yourself? How do you become a strong visual thinker? Okay. Well, the first thing is to translate those visuals into words, and I have a lot of these words, and I still reach for them. There's a lot of vocabulary, and well over an hour worth of information probably contained in this. We can also train our eyes to see the visual cues. Look for the lines, look for the circle, or look for the shapes, look for the repetition and these types of things. The next thing you can do is order, relate, and connect information from different sources, because the language is universal. Additionally, it's important to recognize patterns. Again, because it's something of a universal language, you're going to see the same things used again and again in different contexts in order to relate an idea. And if you continuously look for these patterns, you're going to be able to see how they're used to appeal to your logic or appeal to your emotions. And finally, start creating narratives and stories through photos. Look at a photo and ask yourself, what is the story here? And this is something you can do with your students as well. And start putting stories to things that don't normally lend themselves to storytelling. And this is how you cultivate this type of thinking, and training your eyes to see, training your mind to recognize patterns and come up with stories. So today, what we've mostly talked about is developing strong reading skills in visual literacy. We didn't really talk about how to encode anything, but it's kind of the same process. One is forward and one is backward. When we are reading visual text, first we read the visual text using visual grammar to decode the meaning and infer the message. Now, to write in visual language, we just reverse that process. We write the visual text to infer a message and encode the meaning using the visual grammar. And we will hopefully talk about that portion of encoding and writing in webcasts that are coming up. But as you can see, even just the reading portion was almost too much for this 1 hour. So hopefully you were able to glean a lot of information and a lot of vocabulary, because that's the big part, is to get that vocabulary first, get your grammar. Visual literacy is related to visual media and literacy in general. And the new literacies are a set of abilities that enable the individual to effectively find, interpret, evaluate, and create images and visual media. And hopefully today you have learned how to interpret and evaluate these. And visual literacy skills equip the learner to understand and analyze the contextual, cultural, ethical, aesthetic, intellectual, and technical components. And I think that we covered pretty much most of those. That are involved in the production and the use of visual materials. Now, a visually literate individual is both a critical consumer of visual media and a competent contributor to a body of shared knowledge and culture. And again, this is my attempt to take what I know, put a structure around it and share this knowledge. I am new to teaching. I have a vast amount of knowledge, but what I'm learning is how to contribute that back to a learning community also, because that is part of being visually literate, or being illiterate in the 21st century, is you've got to put back in to the knowledge base. And that is just as critical as being able to consume it and evaluate it. So, if you have any further questions, please feel free to contact me. My email is kae at producersgroup.tv. And coming up, hopefully, we will either dig deeper into some of these topics here in visual literacy, or we might move on to digital literacy, so we can talk a little bit about how to encode and how to write in a visual language. But we covered a lot of topics here, and hopefully it was an elucidating time for you. So I appreciate you sticking this one out, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks.